Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to episode 2 of season 3 of Urban Legends and Mythology. On this much requested episode, we are discussing the infamous John Wilkes Booth. His life, his assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, the manhunt for him, the mystery surrounding the circumstances of his death, and the mystery surrounding the circumstances of his afterlife. But quickly, before we get into that, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Make sure you follow that link in the description to support this podcast. It's as little as $1 a month. If you can afford $1 a month, that goes a long ways towards upgrading equipment and giving you a better sound experience for the show. Also, be sure to share this with anybody and everybody you may come in contact with. We are in 21 countries now. The latest 2 countries are Poland and Mexico, and I am ecstatic about that. So let's keep that growth going. Also, check out the Instagram page. That's your behind the scenes page. There's some pretty crazy, weird stuff going on over there. So be sure to check that out. Also, as always, every episode from now on is a fan requested episode. So I'm not pulling these ideas out of the ether. These are ideas that have been sent to me by you guys, you listeners, and I would appreciate a lot more than that. We have enough requests right now that I am actually slotting them in for season 6, which is like 2025, 2026. So let's keep this going forever. On that note, let's get into the subject at hand. The infamous life, escape, and possible afterlife of John Wilkes Booth. And to help me out today, I'm going to start out with a sip of this delicious Brewdog Hazy Jane IPA. So, as always, let's start at the beginning. And this time we're starting at the beginning of his life. May 10, 1838. The infamous assassin is born. Now, Booth is actually born out of wedlock to some Shakespearian actors. His parents were the noted British Shakespearian actor John Brutus Booth and his mistress Mary Ann Holmes. Now, they had actually moved to the United States from England in 1821, and they purchased a 150-acre farm near Bel Air, Maryland, where Booth was born in a 4-room log home on May 10th, and he was the 9th of 10 children. So, as a kid, John Wilkes Booth, he was actually very athletic and popular. He was skilled at horsemanship and fencing, and he attended the Bel Air Academy. However, he was considered to be an indifferent student. He was intelligent, however, not very interested in the subject matter. He bounces around to a few other schools, even a military academy at one point. However, after the death of his father at the age of 14, he decides to leave school, possibly to seek out work because, his father had just died. Now, at one point during his young age, when he's attending the Milton boarding school, something interesting happens. Booth actually meets with a Romani fortune teller who reads his palm and pronounces a grim destiny, telling him that he would have a grand but short life. He was doomed to die young, and he would meet a bad end. His sister later recalls that he wrote down the palm reader's prediction, showed it to his family and others, and often discussed its portents in moments of melancholy. So he took this seriously. And I kind of get this because if you recall in my divination episode where I kind of slightly touched on palmistry, I did discuss how it's kind of a parlor trick and you can infer based on the person who's presented in front of you how their life is going to go, and you can basically have fun with it. But there is some reality to palmistry. For example, in my own personal experience, there have been twice in my life where I have gone to a palm reader. One was actually at a little party during the release of the final final Harry Potter book. I was there at midnight with my girlfriend at the time, and they had a little palm reader thing, and I checked that out because it was fun. And another time, it was another event I don't remember. However, the strange thing was, both of those palm readers at completely different times in my life gave me pretty much the same prediction. Both of them had told me at completely different times in my life. One I was 17 and one I was in my mid-20s. They told me that I would not find success until late in life. That I would live a long life, however my success in life would come late. And I had to practice patience throughout my life in order to gain the success I was seeking. And to be honest, even though I state that, palmistry is probably a parlor trick, and you can infer from their background, their social class, all this fun stuff, sometimes they're right, and those little predictions stick with you. I remember my girlfriend at the time when I was 17 asking if there was children in her future, and she said it's not likely. And that was kind of funny because even to this day, I don't believe, I'm still friends with her, but I don't believe that she has had any children. So these psychics, these palm readers, these people who are really good at reading body language and stuff, they can predict things that eventually come true based on the factors, whatever they're seeing, or the palmistry itself. And a lot of people will carry that with them for the rest of their life. So when this palm reader told Booth that he would be successful but lead a short life and meet a violent end, he took that to heart. Basically the same way I took to heart that, yes, I will live a long life, but I will find my success later in life. And even to this day, I remember that, and I practice patience because it just sticks with me. So by the age of 16, Booth is out of school and he decides to go into the family profession. He decides he wants to be a Shakespearian actor, just like his father, just like his older brother, and sometimes rival Edwin Booth, who was also aspiring to be a great Shakespearean actor. So at this time, he begins practicing elocution daily, and he decides to start studying Shakespeare, because if you're going to be a Shakespearean actor, you're going to read a lot of Shakespeare. It's also around this time when he starts to get involved in politics. It's said that he supported a Know-Nothing Party candidate who ran on an anti-immigration platform for Congress. His name was Henry Winter Davis in the 1854 elections, and that's kind of where he gets that mentality, which would lead to his political leanings. And to basically sum up the Know-Nothing Party of the 1850s, they were xenophobic, they were anti-Catholic, they had kind of a neutral idea on slavery. They believed that it was okay, however not okay in every situation or whatever. And they believed in this nativist, white American, Protestant kind of America, kind of like a reflection of how modern day Republicans are. They're anti-immigration, they're nativist, they are a little bit racist, to be honest, and they support those kind of old school Christian values. And with that, I probably lost about half of my Republican leaning listeners, but you know what, that's okay. I don't join cults, to be honest. And if you want to get into a political discussion with me, you'll find out that I'm basically an anarchist. So do with that information what you will. But in this context with John Wilkes Booth, you have to understand that his political leanings were being shaped by this party. And this party really came about with the collapse of the Whigs. And, it was splintering off into all this stuff, which would become like the Know-Nothings and even the Southern Democrats at the time. And even there would be some splinter groups, which would become the Republicans and the radical Republicans of the 1860s. So at this time, America, the political parties were really splintering and fracturing in many ways, kind of like how post-1970, the Democratic Party splintered and fractured in all these different segments. But at this time, this is what's shaping Booth's political ideology. So throughout the early 1850s, Booth is diving full force into the family business. He's going to be a Shakespearean actor. And he actually makes his stage debut at the age of 17 on 14 August 1855 in the supporting role of the Earl of Richmond in the infamous play Richard III. And if you want to hear some lines from that, one time I got super drunk back when I first was recording for purposes just to test out this microphone that I use, and I was actually quoting Richard III, drunk out of my mind. If you ever want to hear drunk Shakespeare, maybe I'll release some of that stuff. I might actually do some of it in this episode, but let's get back into it. So he's at the Baltimore Charles Street Theater. He's doing Richard III, and the audience actually is jeering him. If you don't know what jeering is, for my younger listeners, they're basically heckling him. They're telling him, get off the stage. He sucks, blah, 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 because he's missing his lines, you know? However, after this, he begins acting at the Baltimore's Holiday Street Theater, where the Booths had performed frequently. And by 1857, he's really honing his art and he's becoming a well-renowned Shakespearean actor. Now, a lot of people say that Edwin, his older brother, was basically a lot more talented than Booth, but you get that with any acting family. Even in the 1800s, you see that today with acting families and those legacy families. And, you know, he was a great actor. At this point in America, John Wilkes Booth is probably up there with, in my generation, millennials, 90s kids, whatever. You know, we would see him as like Tom Cruise or Mel Gibson or somebody famous like that. This is a famous dude who's going on stage and performing, and he's getting well known and well liked across the country after he's honing his craft. And he becomes what is described as an outrageous scene stealer. However, he plays his parts with such heightened enthusiasm that the audience idolizes him. And actually, a funny incident happens in February of 1858. He's playing Lucrezia Borgia at the Arch Street Theater, and on opening night, for some reason, he experiences stage fright and he stumbles over one of his lines. Instead of introducing himself by saying, "Madam, I am Petruchio Pandolfo," he stammers and he says, "Madam, I am Pandolfo Pedofilio Pacinito Ped, damn it, who am I?" Causing the audience to burst out in laughter. And it's just one of those iconic moments in that art where you kind of make your name for yourself. Which goes to show that he really did know how to captivate an audience. So later in that same year, Booth plays the part of Chief Uncas in a play staged in Petersburg, Virginia, and he becomes a stock company actor at the Richmond Theater in Virginia. And he's becoming increasingly popular with the audiences for these energetic performances. And in October of 1858, he plays Horatio in Hamlet alongside his brother, who plays the title role. And it's said at the end of that show, his brother Edwin leads him to the stage near the front and says to the audience, "I think he's done well, don't you?" To which the crowd responds, "Yes, yes." They give him a standing ovation. They're crying, they're like, "He's awesome, he's great." So this is where Booth has really honed his craft and he's becoming a famous Shakespearean actor. It's said in 1858 he played in 83 plays, and he was stated that his favorite character to play was the role of Brutus, the slayer of the tyrant from Julius Caesar, which would make sense when you look at his political leanings at the time. And in that play, Brutus, he kills Caesar, who has seized power because Brutus wants to preserve the Republic from the dictatorship that Rome is becoming under Julius Caesar. And Booth later would see himself cast in this same role. He believes that Lincoln was a tyrant and he was going to destroy the republic and rule as a dictator in a sense. And he saw himself as Brutus, the person who would kill the tyrant Lincoln. And this all comes back to his political views at the time. We got to remember this is the 1850s, and things like slavery and abolitionism are still really hotbed topics that will eventually lead to the Civil War. Now, Booth was strongly opposed to the abolitionists who sought to end slavery. He was actually so opposed to them that he actually attended the hanging of John Brown, who he believed to be a traitor and a terrorist. For those that don't know, John Brown was a guy from Kansas. He tried to invoke a slave rebellion. It ultimately failed, and he was captured and hanged on December 2nd, 1859. And we have to remember that Booth is from Maryland, and at the time Maryland is a slaveholding state. He's working in Virginia as well, a slaveholding state, and he's part of the wealthy elite. And at the end of the 1850s, Booth was becoming a really wealthy actor. He was making somewhere around $20,000 a year, which is the equivalent to $700,000 a year currently. So he was hobnobbing with these rich elite, and these rich elite in these areas would have naturally been these slaveholding Southerners. So that would have shaped his worldview. And considering that this is the middle of the 19th century, there's no doubt in my mind that, he was a white supremacist. He was a racist. Most people were at the time. The thought of equality, that all people, no matter what the race, are the same, wasn't even on the horizon yet. The big issue a lot of people had at this time was just the institution of slavery. And even abolitionists at the time, a lot of them thought that total equality was something that would happen much later. But back to Booth. So at this time, Booth is a traveling actor. He's well known across the country. He's like the dreamboat actor that every man wants to be and every woman wants to marry. So he's got a good thing going on. However, he's constantly distracted by the politics of the day, the slave issue, and the election of the new Republican president, Abraham Lincoln. It's said that when he was elected president, Booth drafted a long speech which decried abolitionism and upheld and supported Southern slavery, and he gave all his reasons why and blah, blah, blah. And being from Maryland, he was part of that group of Marylanders, mostly slaveholders, who were wanting to join the Confederate States of America. And while they were never successful in the State House in trying to get that secession movement going, they do pass some acts in the State House to kind of quell some of the damage which would be caused by the upcoming war. The state legislature passes a bill and they vote to basically not allow federal troops to pass south through the state by rail, and it also requested that Lincoln remove the growing numbers of federal troops in Maryland. They basically did what Belgium told Germany in World War I. Hey, we're not a pass-through. You're not going to cross these lines solely to invade our neighbors. And they deemed that you are not going to use any of Maryland's infrastructure to wage this war. But the problem with that is a part of Washington, D.C. lies in Maryland. And by doing this, it would leave Washington, D.C. exposed to Southern attack. So in response to this, Lincoln simply suspends habeas corpus in Maryland, enacts martial law in parts of Maryland, and starts having these politicians and any of these supporters or these people who detract from his point of view arrested. He also starts shutting down newspapers that are critical of his presidency. He's got these guys that go in and smash up their printing presses and stuff. And this happens throughout the war, and it only increases throughout the war. And to be honest, I don't care what political side of the spectrum you're on. If you suspend habeas corpus, enact martial law, attack freedom of press and freedom of speech, and start locking up any politicians that oppose you, those are tyrannical acts. That is tyranny, and that can lead to despotism. And you can argue all day that these efforts, while they may have gone too far, were necessary for the war effort, and I won't disagree, but that is extremely dangerous for a republic. And I'm sure that what I just said is basically the mindset that Booth was in at the time. But Booth's not a politician, he's an actor. So throughout the Civil War, he's touring as an actor. Actually, towards the beginning of the Civil War, he was in Albany and he was basically ranting about his admiration for the South and publicly calling it heroic, and this actually enraged a lot of the local citizenry. And to be honest, like most actors who come out saying some crazy political stuff, he was probably asked to tone it down in the future so as not to enrage his fans. However, throughout the Civil War, he's traveling, he's acting, he plays in Chicago, New York, Boston, St. Louis. He's acting all over the place, and people love him. He's a great actor. And Booth was one of the first leading men to play at the infamous Ford's Theater in November of 1863. And it was actually on November 9th in Ford's Theater in 1863. He's in a play called The Marble Heart, where he plays a Greek sculptor and he's making marble statues come to life. So I guess it's kind of a fantasy play. And in the very box where he would later assassinate the president, on that night, President Lincoln is there with his sister-in-law. And it said that at some point in the play, Booth delivers an angry kind of dialogue, and he's pointing right at Lincoln when he says it. At which time his sister-in-law kind of leans over to him and says to the president, "He looks as if he meant that line for you." To which the president replied, "Well, he does look pretty sharp at me, doesn't he?" And on November 25th, 1864, Booth performs for the only time with both his brothers Edwin and Junius in a single engagement production of Julius Caesar at the Winter Garden Theater in New York. He played Mark Antony, his brother Edwin had the role of Brutus, and Junius, I don't remember who he played. But this was billed at the time as the greatest theatrical event in New York history, and the proceeds from that event went to erect a statue of William Shakespeare in Central Park, and that statue is still there today. You can visit it. However, this would be like his last real performance with Edwin, because they were kind of on opposite sides of the political spectrum, and it goes back to that old adage of brother versus brother in the Civil War. In fact, Edwin was a staunch Unionist. He supported the Union. He didn't support this pro-slavery, pro-Confederacy cause, and it actually caused a rift between the two brothers, and Edwin would actually refuse to play shows in southern states, where Booth had no problem playing shows in southern states. So this time the two are kind of going their separate ways. And I'm sure at this time, members of his own family were kind of seeing him as that crazy uncle or whatever that has those radical political beliefs that kind of ruins the family dinners and stuff. We all have that one relative who's like that. And if you don't have a relative who's like that, well, then you are that relative. But it was with the upcoming election of 1864 where Booth would go from actor to political terrorist to assassin. So in 1864, the tide of the war starts to favor the North. And it was said that the likelihood of President Lincoln being reelected had filled Booth with rage, like an undying, burning rage, because he blamed Lincoln for all of the South's problems. He blamed Lincoln for the war. Hell, if he fell down on the ground, he probably would have blamed Lincoln for that too. He had a deep, seething hatred towards this guy at this point. And he even laments and regrets the fact that he, at the beginning of the war, had promised his mother that he would not enlist and fight for the South. And he sees himself as a coward for not enlisting and fighting for the South. So he starts to formulate a plan where he will actually kidnap the president, take him to the South, hand him over to the Confederate Army, and use him as kind of a bargaining chip in a prison exchange in order to end the war peacefully, in the favor of the South, obviously. And to be honest, this wasn't too far-fetched of an idea at the time, because there were still Confederate armies left and still fighting at this point. The war had not ended yet, And even throughout the Civil War, the Confederacy maintained a network of underground operations, mostly in the border states, southern Maryland and stuff. And they were actually relaying messages up to Canada. Montreal was a hotbed for basically Confederate spies, if you want to put it that way. And it was even late in the war when the Confederate Congress created the Confederate Secret Service, which was basically a spy network, a network of sympathizers who were operating throughout the United States and into Canada. And it was set at the lower levels of this network. There were discussions and even plans where they were formulating a plot to kidnap the president to use as a bargaining chip. And it's widely believed to this day that Booth may have been one of these lower level agents in this Confederate Secret Service. And it was around this time when Booth was formulating this plot to kidnap Lincoln and recruiting these guys to help him in this plot. In October, he actually made an unexplained trip to Montreal and was staying at the St. Louis Hall. It's a hotel, I believe. And this was a hotbed for Confederate Secret Service agents who would meet and conspire and whatever. And with Canada and Britain, their overlords, being neutral in the conflict, they were able to operate in Montreal with impunity. They wouldn't be harassed. Now, a lot of people, historians, they'll say that if Booth was involved with this organization, he was probably a low-level courier ferrying messages back and forth, and that's all. There's never been any real hard evidence to link the Confederate government at the time with an assassination plot or a kidnapping plot of the president. The South was really at this time looking for a peaceful way to end the war. And I don't believe, at least in those circles, kidnapping the president or eventually assassinating the president or whatever was on the table. But at the time, Booth and his cronies, they were really investing a lot of time, energy, and money into this kidnapping plot. And this plot actually falls apart in March of 1865, right after Lincoln's second inauguration. An inauguration that Booth and his conspirators actually attended. However, they were just there for the inauguration for whatever reason. I don't know why. However, he was actually a guest of his fiancée at the time, so it was probably just an event that she wanted to drag him along to, because let's remember, at this time, he's one of the biggest stage celebrities in America. But on March 17th, the kidnapping plot would actually fail. Booth had learned that the president would be attending a performance of the play Stillwater's Run Deep at a hospital near the Soldiers' Home, which was kind of where Lincoln stayed most of the time. It was kind of his second residence. So Booth assembles his team on a stretch of road near the Soldiers' Home in hopes of kidnapping Lincoln en route to the hospital, but the president never shows up. He actually, at the last moment, has his plans changed to attend a reception at the National Hotel in Washington, the exact hotel where Booth was actually staying at the time, but he's out on the stretch of road waiting for the president to come out. So at that point, the kidnapping plan kind of falls apart. So that next night on March 18th, 1865, Booth actually performs the final show he will ever perform. He plays a character called Pescara, who's the villain in this play called The Apostate. And all you really have to know about this play is it was written in 1817 by this Irish guy, and he wasn't a great writer. And it's kind of like an Irish knockoff of Romeo and Juliet set in Spain, which I guess is kind of cosmically funny considering his last performance as an actor was a knockoff of a Shakespearian play, and one of the last performances of his life was to basically be a knockoff of Brutus, the guy who killed Julius Caesar, in reality. I don't know, to me there's something cosmically fitting about that. So then we jump to the assassination plot. So for context, on April 11th, 1865, Booth was in a crowd outside the White House when Lincoln gave an impromptu speech from his window. During the speech, he stated that he was in favor of granting suffrage to former slaves. It basically means he's going to give them the right to vote. And this enraged enrages Booth to no end, and it said on that day that he vowed to kill Lincoln. He said that that will be the last speech that guy ever gives. The next day, Booth hears the news story of Robert E. Lee's infamous surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. And with that surrender and the subsequent Union occupation of Richmond, the assassination plot was in play because the kidnapping plot was no longer feasible. You know, the army's collapsing, the government's on the run, so there's no one to really hand him off to, and no officials to really use him as a bargaining chip anymore. At this point, the war is basically over. So on the morning of April 14th, Booth goes to Ford's Theater to get his mail, because that's where he has his mail sent. And, you know, Booth, he's so familiar with this theater, he can go literally anywhere in this theater you want. He's a celebrity. So he hears that Lincoln's going to be attending Our American Cousin that night. So Booth sets his plan in action. He and his associates are going to basically decapitate the Union government. So Booth, he starts making arrangements for this assassination. He's getting everything ready. He gets a horse, he gets an escape route planned, and he's assigning his cronies to doing what they're doing. Powell, he is going to be assigned to murder the Secretary of State William H. Seward, and Atzerodot, another crony of his, he was assigned to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Booth himself would have his starring role in this assassination. He would play out in real life his favorite character to play in these Shakespearian plays, Brutus, the slayer of the tyrant. And the reason Booth is doing this is because he wants to decapitate the Union government. He wants to create chaos throughout the Union, which would give, in his mind, the Confederate government and their armies a chance to reorganize, re-rally support, and continue the fight. However, Booth had wildly miscalculated the pulse of the American people at the time. It was the South that was devastated, and after 4 years of a brutal war, most Americans were done with it, and with that surrender and the collapse of the Confederate government, most people in the Confederacy basically just went back to just being supporters of the Union. They just accepted their fate. The war to them was over. There was no point in fighting on. It was a lost cause. They were more concerned with rebuilding and just moving on into this strange new age. Now, you could argue all day that there were some holdouts and some outlaws and blah, 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 and supporters and even like people like what would become the Ku Klux Klan and stuff who tried to revive the South and keep that fight going. Hell, it still goes on today. But those people were really on the fringes. The vast majority of people just wanted to get back to living their lives. Even the former leaders of the Confederate government were quick to just get back to their everyday lives. However, Booth is one of these extremists, and, he has this grand vision of being the hero. So at 10:14 p.m., he slips into the box and bam, he shoots Lincoln in the back of the head, and then he dives down to the stage and he says those infamous words, "Sic semper tyrannis," or "thus to all tyrants." And then quickly he bursts out the back door, he gets on his horse that's been waiting for him, and he takes off into the night, heading south towards Virginia. Now, some witnesses who were there said that Booth had fractured his leg when he landed on the stage. However, the way he was able to sprint out and mount his horse and disappear indicates that he actually didn't fracture his leg then. It was later on that night when his horse actually tripped and fell on him is when he fractured his leg. Most likely his fibula. I doubt he fractured his tibia because that's a much stronger bone. You can fracture your fibula and still walk on it, but if you fracture your tibia, you are down. You're not getting back up and running off into the night. Now, Booth, he was the only one in the assassination conspiracy to actually kill his target. Powell, he was actually able to stab Seward. However, Seward was able to recover. It wasn't a fatal blow. Atzerodot, he was the one who was assigned to kill President Johnson, well, he actually got drunk, lost his nerve, and never made an attempt. However, since he was part of the conspiracy, he would be later punished for it, and I believed hanged. So here we are. Booth escapes. He gets out of Washington. By midnight, him and the guy he's running with, a man named David Harold, who is helping him plan his escape, they stop at the Surratt Tavern and pick up some guns that they stashed there. On April 15th, they arrive at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who sets his leg, and they tell Samuel Mudd that he broke his leg when his horse tripped and fell on it, which is what I personally believe happened. I don't believe he injured his leg when he fell on that stage. I believe he injured it when a horse tripped and fell on him. That makes more sense. So after this, they're staying with Samuel Cox for a short time. From April 16th to 1821, they're basically staying in the woods, and their plan is to cross the Potomac into Virginia. Now, they stay in the woods from April 16th to April 21st, and on April 21st, they actually land back in Maryland after accidentally going upstream at the home of Colonel Hughes. It's actually April 22nd, I think. They then cross again, and by April 23rd, they land at Lucas Farm and sleep in a cabin. And then after that, April 24th, they reach Garrett's farm, where he is killed. He's shot in that barn on April 26th. Now, the whole time, there's this enormous manhunt. They're being pursued by, I believe it's the Army. Now, the interesting thing is when they get to the Garrett's farm, the Confederate mail service had collapsed, so word of Lincoln's assassination hadn't reached the Garretts yet, and Booth, they don't recognize Booth as the famous actor. He's actually using a pseudonym. They told the Garretts that he was James W. Boyd, a Confederate soldier who was returning home and was actually planning on going to Mexico, and they actually plan a route to Mexico at the Garrett's home. And at the time, the Garretts had no idea who this man was. So the whole time, like I said, they're being tracked by these soldiers, and these soldiers eventually make it to the tobacco farm, and this guy named Cogner actually tracked them down, and a bunch of soldiers show up and they surround the barn and they tell him to surrender. Well, Harold, he surrenders. However, Booth is said to have screamed, "I prefer to come out and fight." So the soldiers set fire to the barn. Now, the whole intention of this isn't to kill Booth at the time, it's to kind of smoke him out. They are under orders to capture him, not kill him. However, things didn't go as planned. So a Sergeant Boston Corbett, who was there, saw him moving around in the fire, and he shoots him, hitting him right in the back of the neck. And Booth drops like a sack of potatoes because he's been hit in the neck, he's paralyzed. Now, according to Sergeant Corbett's account, he fired at Booth because he saw Booth raise his pistol to fire at him. However, that guy Cogner, who was tracking him down, reported to the Secretary of War, Stanton, that Corbett shot Booth without order, pretext, or excuse, and actually recommended that the sergeant be punished for disobeying orders because the intention was to take Booth alive and put him on trial. So they really bungled this operation, which would be a running theme in what's to come. So they drag Booth out of the barn over to the Garrett's porch, and he's paralyzed from the neck down because the bullet had pierced 3 vertebrae and partially severed his spine. And as he lay there dying, he reportedly whispered 2 things. The first thing he whispered was, "Tell my mother I died for my country." And then after that, he asked that his hands be brought up in front of his face, to which he said his infamous last words, "Useless, useless." As dawn was breaking, he died of asphyxiation a few moments later. He was 26 years old. Now, the way they identified his body was in his pockets, they found a diary, 5 pictures of famous actresses, one of his fiancée, and his diary, in which it is said that he writes about the assassination. After this, the government took full control of his body. It ended up on the ironclad USS Montauk. It was then brought to the USS Naval Yard for the autopsy and identification. It was said that it was identified by more than 10 people, and they were able to find some identifying features. One was a tattoo on his left hand with the initials JWB, and another was said to be a distinct scar on the back of his neck. However, considering he had been shot through the neck with a firearm and they actually surgically removed 3 of his vertebrae, don't really know how they were able to identify that scar. The body was then buried in the Arsenal Penitentiary under a storeroom, and then eventually in 1869 it makes its way to the Booth family plot in the cemetery, where it's laid to rest with 40 in attendance, thus ending the tale of the life of the infamous John Wilkes Booth. However, that's not the end of our story. Our story is actually just beginning, because a lot of people believe to this day that John Wilkes Booth wasn't the man who died in that barn, that the U.S. government actually bungled the operation so badly that they killed a possible acquaintance or accomplice of Booth, while at the same time Booth actually slipped away, spent the rest of his life out west. And that's the story we're going to get into now, because this gets really fun. So we're probably all asking ourselves right now, what was the point of that 40-minute Wikipedia-esque biography about John Wilkes Booth? And the reason why I gave that big long biography about him was to get into the mindset of this man. He's a 26-year-old political radical who assassinates the President of the United States. He's a well-known actor. He's one of the most famous actors in America at the time, and this dude could quote Shakespeare from memory. And the fact that he was such a great, well-renowned, well-trained actor would serve him well in this new chapter, his life on the run after his death. So the next part of our story takes us to Granbury, Texas. It's kind of in central Texas in the 1870s, when a drifter shows up into town and starts a saloon right next door to the Granbury Opera House, where Shakespearian plays, would happen. This man had dark hair, striking features. He was built like a bodybuilder, and he tended to not talk about his past. He kept his own counsel. It's said that he drifted to southern towns and just kept moving on. He could never commit to one place. Now, the locals of Granbury said that this mysterious man could recite Shakespeare from memory, and on one occasion, on actually April 14th of some year in 1870s, he actually drunkenly did so. He climbed onto the theater stage during a production and started reciting Shakespeare from memory. This man went by the name of John St. Helen and was very popular in this small town. However, I don't know what saloon keeper isn't the most popular person in town. However, it was said that St. Helen acquired a reputation for being more cultured than the average saloon keeper. It was pretty obvious that he was more cultured than the average saloon keeper, and he was known as a character. While popular, he was not really friendly. He was argumentative, he had a hot temper, and apparently he could get fiery and passionate about certain subjects. And he loved the theater. He would frequent the opera house next door. So the next few years kind of pass on quietly. He's keeping to himself, he's doing his job, he's going to the theater, whatever. He's living in that town. However, in 1878, St. Helen, he falls very ill. So ill that he fears that he's about to die. So St. Helen calls his friend, a lawyer named Phineas Bates, to his bedside, because he thinks he's going to die, and he has a deathbed confession. And he tells Phineas Bates that, "I'm about to die. My name is John Wilkes Booth. I am the assassin of President Lincoln. Get the picture of myself from under the pillow. I'll leave it with you for my future identification. Notify my brother Edwin Booth in New York City." And then St. Helen goes on to tell him the story of how he escaped that night and made his way out west. So St. Helen goes on to explain the following story. So during the Civil War and on this very night, all the bridges out of Washington were closed after nightfall and heavily guarded, but he had been given a password that allowed him to cross. Now, one of the guards on duty that night, a man named Frederick Demon, wrote in a letter that at about 10 p.m., a captain rode up to the bridge and said if anyone comes up using a certain password to let them cross. And that password was TB Road. And Demon says that this was very peculiar because never before had anyone been allowed to cross this bridge with a password, so he thought that was strange. But the guy is a captain, and you're going to listen to what the captain says most of the time. However, this account differs from another guy who was guarding the bridge, a Sergeant Silas Cobb, who was in charge of the squad at the bridge. Now, he didn't say anything about passwords. All he said in his account was, I thought these people were proper people to go across the bridge, and I let them cross. Obviously referring to Booth and his accomplices. Now, those accounts of those soldiers on the bridge, they weren't what Booth actually told his lawyer friend, but I'm throwing those in there for context. So while Booth was fleeing, his horse trips and rolls over onto his leg, breaking it, and he's forced to continue the rest of the escape hidden in the back of a wagon. So while Booth is a fugitive right now and he's on the run and he's hiding in the back of this wagon, he does have all his personal papers on him, all the stuff that can link him to his identity, his diary, a picture of his fiancée, various, I guess, papers, legal stuff, I don't know. So at one point while he's in the back of his wagon with all these papers, he thinks he hears Northern soldiers approaching and moving in. So in a panic, he gets out of the wagon. The guys he's with kind of hustles him out of the wagon and kind of dumps him in the woods to hide while these soldiers are going by, and he loses his papers. So what happens next is, I guess the soldiers go off, he gets back in the wagon, and he's in such a hurry and a rush that, they have to get out of there, but call it vanity or whatever, he actually sends a messenger back to go retrieve his papers, and I guess his diary and all those photos and whatnot that he was carrying with him. So he sends this messenger back, and the messenger collects the papers or whatever. However, another messenger arrives with bad news. Union soldiers were closing in, and Booth could no longer sit and wait for his papers, so he just got the hell out of Dodge. He left immediately, and it was the man who Booth sent back to retrieve his papers was the man who was shot in that tobacco barn on the Garrett's farm. And this does bring up an interesting question about the surroundings of his death, because there are a lot of people who came out and said that they were not sure that he was that man in that barn. And even some high-ranking military officials at the time questioned Booth's death. For example, when the body was identified, the body had a reddish hair. Booth's hair was jet black, and it was famously noted as being jet black. So reddish hair on this body in this barn makes you question whether or not they did kill that person. And it gets even deeper. In the early 1900s, a man named John Shoemaker, he was the Army's general counsel to the Department of the Army. He actually wrote that evidence put forth by the government to support the conclusion that the body was of John Wilkes Booth was so insubstantial that it would not stand up to a court of law. And it goes on to account that the most persuasive evidence at Garrett's barn that the man in the barn was not Booth is in fact his friend David Harold, who he was running through the woods with, came out of the barn, and the first thing he said was, the man in that barn is not Booth. And even a Lieutenant William C. Allen, who worked for the United States Secret Service in 1865, had told his wife that the man that he saw killed at Garrett's farm had red hair, and that the government knew that this man was not Booth, but they were determined to foist this man on the nation as Booth because they wanted him caught and killed basically as soon as possible. And there was another man there named Kinsey. He was a quartermaster, and he was literally free to go wherever he wanted on the battlefield, between military lines, whatever. And he went to Garrett's barn because he has an interest in what was going to happen with Booth. And in 1922, when he was 77 years old, he detailed what he saw at Garrett's farm in a sworn affidavit, and quote, "As I rode up, Joe Ziggin called, 'Here come the sergeant. This ain't John Wilkes Booth at all.' I could see the color of his hair. I knew at once he wasn't he. His body had been exposed and he had no injured leg." And there are even further accounts that are in the National Archives. One account by a doctor who had removed a tumor from Booth's neck in the same year he killed Lincoln. He was told that it better damn well be John Wilkes Booth's corpse that you're looking at. And in that affidavit, it is stated that it is in my opinion that this man does not look like John Wilkes Booth, but this man is John Wilkes Booth. However, the Union government at the time, they really needed this win, so there may have been pressure to get this win, and while they're focused on this, Booth escapes to the South. Now, where he was for the next 7 or 8 years until he washes up in Texas in 1873 is anyone's guess. It's said that he was bouncing around from small southern town to small southern town using various pseudonyms, up to 35 different pseudonyms, until he ends up in Granbury. So after St. Helen tells Bates this amazing grand story of this escape, a few days later his fever breaks and he wakes up feeling fine. However, he knows that he's just told his deepest, darkest secret to this guy. So he decides once again to get the hell out of Dodge. So he gets up, he insists on paying the boarding house for a horse, and he rides away to Colorado. And John St. Helen is not heard from again. But even that's not the end of our story. It gets even crazier. So on the morning of January 13th, 1903, in Enid, Oklahoma, in a hotel, began screaming. This guest's name was David E. George, and soon after he was found dead. So they call in a doctor to take this dead man, and he discovers that he had died from self-administered arsenic poisoning, suicide. The man wasn't locally known, but he was said to be a house painter who loved alcohol and often quoted Shakespeare, and he had jet black hair and walk with a limp. And at one point he was even quoted as saying, "I had killed the best man who had ever lived." And to be honest, a lot of people think that quote is attributed to him assassinating Lincoln, but I personally think he was referring to himself. Let's not forget, he was hailed as one of the greatest Shakespearian actors of his era. He was only 26 when he killed the president. He was wealthy, he was adored by his fans, and to be honest, that probably gave him a pretty big ego. So I think he was talking about he killed himself and his potential for his great future on that night when he assassinated the president, and he could no longer be John Wilkes Booth, the actor. Now, David E. George, the guy who killed himself from arsenic, was embalmed and placed in the window of a funeral home for public viewing. Now, generally embalmers of the era would do this for a few different reasons. One, they're showing off their great embalming work, so it's marketing. And two, nobody has claimed the body, so he has the body sitting there hoping that some relative or friend or whatever may recognize him and be able to claim the body. This was a common practice at the time. And to be honest, we still kind of do this today. Now, we don't embalm them and prop them up in windows, but when somebody dies, like a homeless person or a person that didn't have family or something like that, or a person living under a pseudonym, a lot of the times the funeral home will get the body and cremate it, and then they'll post in like a newspaper or social media or somewhere an obituary of this person and stating that if there are any relatives or friends who may want these remains, that they are free to come get them. And to be honest, these remains are never disposed of. I've actually seen in funeral homes that have been operating for like forever, where in the basement they'll have human remains, cremins, from people that died in like 1903 that were never claimed. They never get rid of them. They hold on to them just hoping that one day somebody will claim these remains. And when you think about it, it is kind of sad that somebody could die and just be forgotten and their family never gets closure. But it actually is kind of a common practice in the funeral industry. But I digress. So, George is sitting in this window in this funeral parlor, and the locals actually begin to comment on his likeness to the infamous assassin, John Wilkes Booth. Remember, we're only 38 years post the assassination, so most of the people who were living during that time and remember him know what he looks like. They had his photographs, they had his tintypes. He was a famous actor, so they would be commenting that he looked like this famous actor. So what happens next is Phineas Bates, the lawyer from Texas who John St. Ellen confessed to, comes back into the picture. He's living in Memphis. Somehow he gets word about this and he arrives in Enid and he identifies the body as his friend John St. Helen, and they release the body to Bates. And what does Bates do with this embalmed body, which is preserved for long-term preservation? Well, he cashes in. He makes a buck off of it. He begins leasing the body out to carnival sideshows, and it's even displayed at the 1904 World's Fair, and it's billed as John Wilkes Booth, the man who assassinated Lincoln, along with this crazy story. So John St. Helens' body, or Booth's, is making its way around the carnival sideshow circuit, and it lands in Chicago in 1931. And in 1931, 6 Chicago physicians examined the mummified body of John St. Helen and recorded their findings in an affidavit. They specifically noted a scarred right eyebrow, a crushed right thumb, and a broken left leg. John Wilkes Booth was known to have all of these unusual characteristics. However, unfortunately for us in the modern day, sometime after 1931 and Bates's eventual death, the body is sold off by his wife, possibly to a carnival sideshow or something similar. However, it disappears from the public, and who knows where it could have ended up. Some people think it may have ended up just falling apart and being tossed in the trash, or some people think that maybe it's stuffed in someone's attic somewhere, or it's in some old barn, or hell, maybe it's even in a prop house in Hollywood. Have you ever seen a Hollywood prop house? Those places are enormous. However, the story doesn't even end here. It actually ends back at the Granbury Opera House in Texas, right next to that saloon that John St. Helen worked in. It is said that John St. Helen was known to quote Shakespeare from memory. He was very refined and cultured, and he obviously had a love for the theater. And given the thought that this was probably the town where he spent the longest part of his life after bouncing around all these places in the South, he probably grew to love this particular theater, which is why it is believed that he still returns to this theater in the afterlife. And to this very day, actors, crew members, and visitors to the opera house say that they usually see a man dressed in black passionately reciting Shakespeare on stage, even in the dead of night when nobody else is around. And when he finishes his triumphant performance, he takes a bow and vanishes. And it is even said that during performances at the opera house, he'll usually be sitting somewhere in the crowd, probably right next to you, enjoying the show, which I think is a fitting afterlife for a great Shakespearian actor who threw everything away at a young age and was forced to live with the results of his own Shakespearean tragedy. And on that note, I think that's where I'll leave it for tonight. I have to be honest, this was one of the most difficult episodes I have ever had to create. This episode literally took 3 different recording sessions and countless hours of research into this guy's life. Now, I had always been vaguely aware of this myth, and to be honest, I really didn't think there was enough source material there to create a whole episode. But when it was suggested to me, I dove into every aspect of this guy's life, and then I dove into every little rabbit hole that came with that mythology surrounding the escape, and it became a fascinating story. And I'll be honest, with the future of this series being mostly fan-picked episodes, I'm primarily going to research and do the episodes that have the most requests, and this one had like 40 different requests. So I thought, oh, I have to deep dive into this, and I actually learned a lot. Like, to be honest, I had no idea that he was so young when he assassinated the president. I always assumed he was in his 30s or something, but that was just something I learned, and I thought it was awesome. And that was the whole point why I made this series in the first place. It's for not only the listener to learn something new that they might not have heard about, but also for me to do the research and to learn new things about these subjects that I think I know about. But then, like I said, I dive down those rabbit holes and I learn new stuff, and it is amazing. And I thank you, listeners, for giving me that opportunity to pursue that. But as always, if you like what I'm doing and you want to hear more, go ahead and click that follow button, click that listener support button. It's as cheap as $1 a month. If you can afford $1 a month, that goes a long ways towards upgrading equipment and all that stuff. Check out the Instagram page, that is growing, and as always, tell a friend. That's how this podcast grows. It grows by word of mouth. If you just tell somebody, hey, check out this podcast, that really goes a long way towards helping out the show. And yes, for those supporters, I am working on some stuff. I'm a one-man operation, so it is slow, but I will have special things for you all in the future. But as always, this is Mike, and I will see you in the next episode.